Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's another Wednesday. It's another Wednesday. Where is Tony Fortunato? Hi, Tony.
Hello, hello, hello.
There you go.
Danny and Tony today.
Yeah. And hi, Tim. Thank you for that.
Oh my gosh.
And that's a guy with one leg. See what he can do with two legs.
I can just imagine.
So Tony, we have a lot to talk about today, including the whole concept of network auditing. But maybe I should give it to Tim first. Give us an update. Something's happening on the acquisition front, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got a great bunch of stuff going on. We got NetScout buying Fluke.
So that's official now?
Well, it's not official yet, but it's been approved and it's moving forward. This is really a turtle race right now because they've got a lot to do. It's a huge acquisition, but I'm here to tell you it's going to make NetScout one of the most powerful testing organizations in the world. And it's got a great management. It's got people that love working there and have been there for years. It's going to make a huge difference in our technology. We're going to see in about 2 years after this, we'll see a quantum leap in the monitoring capability, analysis, security, all compiled into one group. Of course, we all know that Riverbed got bought by Thoma Bravo. We're seeing a lot of changes there. We're going to see a renewed company. We'll see how it goes. And the only other new thing is I got a chance to meet some virtually. I got to meet some gentlemen from a company called Monitus, M-O-N-I-T-I-S, and it's network monitoring, web monitoring. So it's a new company, Armenia, coming over to the United States, and I think we're going to get a chance to interview them on Love My Tool pretty soon. But today we got something special. We got Tony talking about network auditing. You know, and Tony and I go way back. I go so far back that I did baselining on WAN. Okay, that's how far back I go. And everything that was byte-oriented protocols. But it's an imperative that people begin to understand, I call it the physiology of their network. Because just like a human, when you go to the doctor, he takes your pulse, he listens to your heart, looks in your eyes, pinches your skin, you know, he finds out what the physiology of his patient is. And a network, for all practical purposes, is a neurological type system. And it's an imperative to baseline different aspects. And today Tony's going to tell us how to baseline the routers. And it's always fun when you baseline your routers and all of a sudden, or you audit your routers, and all of a sudden you find out that there's some new routers out there that you didn't put in. Could be Wi-Fi routers, could be a virtual situation, but it is interesting what people find out. And as Tony pointed out, and we'll say again, most of the time people say, oh, it's working fine. But Tony's comment was what, Tony?
It's working fine, but it's not working well. That's why I'm here.
Right. And that's what it should be.
And with that, Tony, why don't you do what you're supposed to do?
Sure. And just one last news item that I read this morning that Tim didn't touch on. I heard that Verizon is buying AOL for like $4.4 billion or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
Wow.
Pocket change. Pocket change.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, AOL has a history that they would be sold again later on at half a price, right?
Oh yeah, at least. At least.
For some reason, that's how it works.
All right, so let me get on over here and share my screen. Okie dokie. There we go.
By the way, we have Bill Gibson saying hello to us.
Oh, Bill. Hey, Bill. Yeah. Yeah. He's from New York, if I'm not mistaken. All right, so here we go. So routing audit. This is a couple of slides I put together based on the article that I wrote up, and the article was a bit of a departure from what I usually do. Usually I do a little video, and this time I just did a little write-up. And I was telling Denny earlier that basically I was doing some work with a customer, and I always go through these little mental checks that I do, and at one point I got to this routing audit, and the guy said, that's kind of interesting, and I explained what it was and why I did it. And the fellow said, you should really write that up, you know. And I thought, huh, I guess I should. And here we are.
We agree.
Well, by the way, in the last 6 years, someone has said that 305 times, to be exact.
No kidding.
Right? every time you wrote an article and love my tool, that's how it goes.
Yeah, sometimes it's the voice in my own head, but yeah, I heard that.
Okay.
All right, so why audit your routing? And this is a typical network, and I'm just using this kind of as a backdrop for the next few slides. As you can see down here, we've got two computers in the bottom left-hand corner. You've got the one on the far right here underneath Dallas. And you can see in Toronto there are two routers. There's a backup and a primary, and it goes to the the ubiquitous cloud, and off it goes to Dallas. Well, even in this environment, I explain to people that a routing audit starts with just defining routing. And as Tim threw out correctly a few minutes ago, routers or access points, that sort of thing. But I also try to bring to people's attention the fact that routing, just the process of routing, doesn't have to be a router. It could be a layer 3 switch, as Tim said earlier, an access point, but there's routing also in our computers. Servers with multiple interfaces, virtual environments. Within the virtual environment, there may be routing. So when I say routing audit, I literally mean routing, because sometimes I'm dealing with the desktop people, and they say we don't do routers, and I explain routing is a concept. It's not really a router. It's the point that you're sending information somewhere. So even in this environment, down here, those two computers in the bottom left-hand corner, 20.20 and 30.21, those could be on different subnets off the same switch, which means that switch has many VLANs, and that switch might be a layer 3 switch. So how are these devices getting from, in this case, Toronto to Dallas? In some cases, I found that the quote-unquote the backup link, which kicks in when there's obviously an issue, is actually running. Unbeknownst to anyone else, and guess what? Some of the traffic is going through the backup link. So this really brings up a whole, I'm going to say, a plethora of issues. If things are up when they're not supposed to be, then it could upset that routing balance, depending on the protocol and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, just how you get from point A to point B is a big deal. So from this diagram, I'm going to kind of go to the next one. And the methodology. And the methodology to me is quite simple. The easiest thing to do is a simple trace route. And with Windows, it's trace route and then trace RT for other OSs. But the point is, you go to a device like just a PC, a laptop, server, whatever, and you do a trace route to the other end, the device at the other end of your network. And in some cases, you may want to do a trace route to quote-unquote the internet. So traceroute google.com, for example. The big issues we run into in some environments is traceroute uses a protocol called ICMP, and ICMP may be blocked either by the receiver, some intermediate network device, or possibly your own router or firewall, and that's becoming quite common. So what do you do? And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But at the end of the day, when you start using traceroute, if that's going to be your methodology, you have to make sure you document that. And later on, I'll talk a little bit about writing a batch file and that sort of thing. But that's kind of step one. How are you going to measure that route? Because there's many ways to do it, of course. And some traceroute tools don't use ICMP, and you have to make sure you understand what protocol it is using, so on and so on and so on. So when we talk about the methodology, I just mentioned ICMP might be blocked, and the easiest way around that is capture a packet from a device on the far end of your network. And when you do that with Wireshark or Sniffer, Network Instruments, whatever tool you decide to use, when you capture that packet, inside of the IP header, you'll see the time to live. So if you know, for example, this one says 56, and if it started at 58, for example, the math is quite simple, and you can determine, how many hops it took that packet to get to you. Further to that, if you want to monitor a conversation, if you're troubleshooting somebody connecting to a server, and you want to know if that route is quote-unquote, I call stable or consistent, you simply add that time to live as a column. So what I'm going to do at this point, something a little different that I didn't do with my other sessions, I'm actually going to flip to Wireshark for just one moment. So let me just change my screen share, and this time I'm going to choose Wireshark. There we go. And there we are. So here we are in a Wireshark trace file. It's pretty typical, just a whole bunch of stuff. And people typically will ask me, how do you do that? How do you add that stuff? It's actually quite simple. In the old days, you'd have to go to the preferences and the columns and add stuff. But there's a much easier way to add columns. So from here, if I just go to View and I turn on my detail pane, it shows me, quote unquote, I call it the guts of the packet. And when I come down the list here, I'll find my time to live. So by simply highlighting that, I can simply right-click, and it's the terminology is apply as a column. As soon as you do that, you'll see a column appear, and now I see all the time to lives. The only other thing I have to do here is create something called a one-way filter. Now with the screen share, I know that as soon as I go to a menu, you're not going to see it. But you simply under Statistics, Conversations, and you pick, quote-unquote, a one-way filter. The other way around it is just simply click on the source header, and it sorts them all. So now you can see in this case they're all 56, 56, 56, 56. And if it was 56, 54, 56, 56, 54, 53, 54, then you know there's something going on with the routing. Now if that's intentional, fantastic. But if it's not intentional, well then there's a red flag for you. So let me just come back here and turn on my little presentation again. Surprised that went as smoothly as it did, actually. And there we go. And that's what this screen does for you right here. So I illustrated that. Now I'll take the PowerPoint if you like, and I'll actually put a link to it or stick it on the end of the YouTube video or give it to Denny. So the other note is the routing is usually taken for granted, and I say this all the time because people think if you can get there, then obviously it's working. And as I said earlier, sarcastically, and I'm not trying to prove if it's working. I'm trying to prove how well it's working. And I always throw in the very common little comment. Anybody in this field 10 years or longer I think will relate to this. Let's face it, in the last 10 years or so, things don't break like they did in the 90s, right? And I always joke, this is true by the way, people like Tim will tell you, in the 90s vendors would sell you things by saying things like, my product will not break before my competitor's product. And the mean time between failure, that was a marketing term, believe it or not.
It still is in some circles.
What was that, Tim?
It still is in some circles.
I know. And but the thing is, nowadays, in the last 10 years or so, network equipment's far more resilient. It's not breaking. Things aren't dying. Things aren't blowing up. So nowadays we have performance-related issues, and this could be relating to your performance-based issue. In the past, I've uncovered things like routing loops. You might have a routing loop today. Everything's going to work. It's just not going to work well. Multiple routes, extra hops. The important thing to keep in mind when you go through this exercise is make sure that you do multiple tests, because sometimes you happen to do that test and everything looks fine, but then guess what? Tomorrow, noon, end of the quarter, whatever other period of time, you might notice that things are dramatically different. And the big plus here is, and I tell people to think of it this way, if you did a routing audit, if you just did a simple trace route to your server and everything looked fine, there's a tremendous amount of value in that because you've just created a baseline. So now you know how many hops it takes to get to the router, you know the timings, and better yet, you know that equals good. So tomorrow when it's not good and you did the same exercise and get a different result, that would help resolve the issue. And conversely, if you have a problem and you do the same thing and you get the same good results, now you know what it's not. So you really can't lose by doing this simple exercise. And it doesn't take long. It really doesn't take long. So some causes of the routing issues that I've seen in the past: improperly configured routing protocols. To this day, I still find routing configurations from the vendor's examples. And I've seen it so many times that I actually know some of these examples verbatim. So when I see that same pattern in network equipment, it kind of raises a flag that they put the configuration in, quote unquote, it worked well enough, I can do what I need to do, and let's move on. And that to me is kind of a red flag because many times there may be extra commands in that example, commands that don't apply to you, that sort of thing. But more importantly, there may be commands that you missed for tuning to make it better. Sometimes there's a failure to understand how automatic, or I call them auto-tragic, routing values are calculated. So if you do use a routing protocol that's going to calculate distance or response time and make those routing decisions for you, you better understand how that works. and sometimes there's a deciding factor as the MAC address of that interface for a quote-unquote a tiebreaker, or the time or the speed of the interface, or some kind of routing metric. You should understand how that works. This is becoming more of an issue, this one right here, mixing multiple routing protocols on the same interface. And I'm seeing this more and more, where people might have started with RIP and then evolved to IGRP and then EIGRP and then OSPF, and all being equal, if you're using them for all the same reason, they may have left the older routing protocols with the same old tagline, we'll clean it up later. And guess what? Later never comes. So you've got to be able to go back or make a note, or part of your change process is to go back and clean that stuff up. In some examples, you may actually require multiple routing protocols, but on different interfaces. And that leads to the next point, not defining passive interfaces. And what that means is, on many different vendors' equipment, if you enable a protocol, OSPF for example, it gets turned on everything. And you may not even notice that because the interfaces you're using it on are working. So you'd never really thought to go check, for example, your local interface. And I've seen OSPF or other protocols running internally on their networks because guess what? It just does. It's smart enough to figure it out. And you might not want that. So to turn off those routing protocols, for example, internally or on a WAN interface that you don't want it on, some vendors, such as Cisco, will call it a passive interface. It says, hey, don't participate in this. Don't do that. Unstable network environments. Now, this is a big one. I've been involved with quite a few wireless implementations, not just corporately for laptops and phones and whatnot, but outdoor long-range wireless. And some outdoor wireless, because it's wireless, if you don't have a quote-unquote stable link, which can happen just based on environmental and stuff like that, some routing protocols are not conducive to those types of environments. If you don't know that, then you're going to put a routing protocol in. It's going to consider it not stable, or it's up, it's down, or we call it flapping, and you're going to have another issue. So make sure you understand if the network is stable. Sometimes it's as easy as just a continuous ping with a large packet size to find out if you're dropping any packets or if the response time's all over the map. Again, if you can ping. The evolving network changes are not being monitored, and this is a very common one with large corporations. And I did some work for a corporation with over 120,000 nodes worldwide, and that's huge. And they've got different networking departments and different people touching routers, and of course everybody's in a silo and that sort of thing. That's a very common thing to see. But in this case, people are making changes, their changes, and quote unquote, that's all I care about. But at the end of the day, other people are also touching that router for different reasons, but nobody is tracking holistically what's being done, and again, what's being cleaned up, that sort of thing. And sometimes you add a routing protocol and it takes precedence, or you add a routing protocol and you think it's doing the job, but the older routing protocol is kicked in and is doing the job for you. So the more complicated the environment, the more diligent you have to be. This is a big one. I'm sure Tim's going to say something about this. Blindly adding IP version 6 to an existing environment. I just ran into this just last week.
Actually, Tim doesn't even care if you do it blind or not.
And 2 weeks ago, I had a customer who literally, as quote-unquote, they were doing some testing, which is fine, and they enabled IPv6 on their router, and they enabled it on a couple of boxes, and they needed to move around their network, and they just started enabling IPv6 along the way, and inadvertently had built an IPv6 routing environment that started causing some performance issues that they had not thought of. So whenever you're adding a new protocol, it's the same as adding a new routing protocol, so just kind of keep that in mind. The effect of IP port forwarding or helper addresses or DHCP relays. Those, I've seen them, believe it or not, I've seen them cause routing issues, routing loops. Because these commands, for example, these types of technologies, they basically tell the router to stop doing what it's always done, which is drop that broadcast packet. Right. These commands tell the router, hey, if you see, for example, a DHCP packet, send it to my server. But some of these commands, like a helper address, will forward a whole host of protocols as well as DHCP. And at the other end, on the DHCP server side, if there's yet another helper address, somebody left by mistake, then guess what? It's going to send it off somewhere else. I've seen IP helper addresses with broadcast addresses. And basically now, your router's become a bullhorn and it's sending stuff every which way it can, because it can. So just be careful. Legacy routing protocols not cleaned up or maintained, and this is a big one. And one of my more loyal customers calls me all the time, and they've started calling me the network janitor, because I'll come in and say, well, why is RIP still on this? Or why are you bridging still? NetBuoy's not being used. Or why is IPX still on this router? And I'll ask those questions, and if there's a legitimate answer, great. And if there's not, let's just get rid of it. You don't need it. And sometimes those legacy routing protocols come back to bite you. Actually, the worst case scenario, it just reminded me of a story where the customer had some legacy equipment and it was using the legacy routing, not the new routing. And when they got rid of the legacy routing, all the old stuff broke. And they didn't even realize that. So we needed to know that just moving forward as we migrated them to the new network. The implementation of service level monitoring that changes routes, and this is becoming quite popular with many vendors, where on the router you can ask the router, hey, go ping, for example, google.com, or go ping the router in Seattle. And you can tell the router, ping it. If you lose 60% of the packets, then take that out of the route. And you can do all that, leave it in the router, and it's kind of like a batch job or a cron job or a scheduled job, however you want to call it. And the router's just silently in the background based on your interval. It's constantly checking and checking, and when it thinks something bad happens, it will do that for you. The issue I have with some of these Automagic implementations is the fact that you don't have alerts. You might not have thought of, hey, when it does change, how do I know that? Is it going to send me a trap? Am I going to get an email? How do I know if that's happening? For one customer, I actually wrote a Perl script that does this, because the Perl script allowed us to send an email. So every time the service level was triggered, guess what? We get an email knowing that router X is no longer routing and router B is now routing, that sort of thing. Deploying multicast and not monitoring its impact. And multicast is becoming a big issue. In the past, multicast, in my opinion, again, was more associated with things like imaging, ghosting, copying files, like doing that mass imaging exercise that some IT departments do. Nowadays, multicast is more apt to describe a video application. The CEO is doing a big announcement today. Everybody needs to see it. Or we have a training video that everybody needs to watch for 20 minutes and it's going to be multicasted, that sort of thing. Well, sometimes you deploy multicast and you build a whole new routing infrastructure to support that. So make sure if you do decide to do that or tweak the existing environment that you don't inadvertently cause another issue. The one on the bottom I've run into again a few times, and that's when you have quote-unquote the original router doing just fine, everything's configured great, and you replace the router or you add faster interface speeds. So maybe it had a 100 meg interface and the same router now is going to have a gig interface. Or maybe the gig wasn't being used and you're enabling it today. And by changing the speed, some routing algorithms will change the way in which it routes. So again, you have to understand, going back to the second point, failure to understand how automatic routing values are calculated. Sometimes you just make what you think is a simple change, enabling an interface, and all of a sudden you've changed everything. And in some routers with some routing algorithms, just by changing which interface is routing, the order of that interface changes your routing algorithm. Okay? Don't forget, routing tests should be performed from any device that supports routing, and this is what I was saying earlier. So just think of anything like servers, access points with multiple IP subnets, layer 3 switches, firewalls, routers. And the very last one I think is becoming more and more of an issue, and I've talked about this before, PCs with Ethernet and Wi-Fi that are both enabled. And in some cases, the Ethernet might be on your corporate network, the Wi-Fi is going to the guest network, and some operating systems, again, certain configurations, the Wi-Fi was on first and you're going to hold on to that. You connect your Ethernet and you're still going through the Wi-Fi. Or you try to connect to something and you have some kind of connectivity delay, not down and out, just delay. With enough delay, your PC might give up and go through the other interface. So you need to understand how that behaves. So after your testing, if you find any anomalies that you can address, tune and please retest. And this is a mantra that we use in all of my presentations. Retest, retest, and retest some more. After you're satisfied with your routing audit, you should determine how often it should be performed. So sometimes that's an obvious thing to state because we are upgrading the router or we're making a change tonight. All right, fine, you can change. But sometimes you might want to say, wait a minute, if we have increased load, the other router might kick in, or there's load balancing, and I want to be able to check that. So you might not want to wait for a change. You might want to just do this a little more occasionally. The point of that sentence is also that the end there, it says, if there are any other ways to automate or test the path. That's kind of key because sometimes you want to do this manually at the beginning just so you understand how it works. But as you've done this a few times, you might want to say, you know what, I wonder if I can just do this every hour in some kind of script. I'm not hurting anything. Sometimes there are tools that will monitor your routing for you. But other times, such as in point 3, you can just write a simple batch file, and it redirects the output to a file. So at the beginning, you might just do traceroute to the techfirm.com, and a little greater than, that's your redirector, the techfirm._traceroute.text, and it just writes to it. If you want to append, you just do 2 of those greater than signs. It'll just append to it. And then you can just look at it whenever you want. And that tends to make things go a little easier. And there's a ton of variations on this same theme. You might want to check with your vendor documentation. Some devices have the ability to report changes. Again, for example, Cisco, you've got this EIGRP log neighbor change command. You put that in, and guess what? Every time the neighbors change, it gets logged. If you do have OSPF, there's a similar command for that. And trust me, every single one has a similar command. But the key here is if you're going to let it log to something, I would strongly advise you to have a mechanism in place that can tell you that was logged. Not just silently being logged or syslogged or however you want to do it, but something that says, oh, by the way, the actual neighbor changed. You know, some kind of alert, an email, a pop-up, something to get your attention, not just silently being written in a log. With other devices, you might find logs that record any routing changes or even the ability to send a trap to your network management application. And I'm a big fan of traps because traps are event-driven, right? If nothing happens, there is no event, there is no trap. So that's kind of an interesting little theory I like to use, as opposed to being bombarded with information constantly and you get to the point where you start to become desensitized and you ignore it altogether. And that's it. So that's my routing audit. And I was telling Denny earlier that I do many other flavors on the same theme, broadcast analysis or VLAN analysis. There's many other examples of these types of mini audits that I do. And trust me, if you do these things once or twice, the third time, this is a non-issue. It's less than a minute. And that's the other thing that I do in my Wireshark classes. I teach you at least a dozen baselines that take less than 1 minute. Why? So you do it. And then if you want something more comprehensive, you string them all together, and you can actually do that as well. That's it. There you go, Denny.
Thank you, Tony. I like how you take an article that you have already written and then just kind of put in the presentation format. Sometimes because you got more feedbacks from the readers, and it gives you a little perspective. Sometimes because there's some timely events, something happens at work, and I like it. I like it like that.
Cool.
So we need to do more. Also, I actually cross-referenced this episode with shockfest.tv. Shockfest.tv is just another landing page. That's where we put all the Shockfest-related article. But I kind of took that a step further and say, hey, anything that is technical in nature and vendor neutral belongs there as well. And because it's meant for the same audience. And especially now that we're a little bit more, just a little bit more than a month, less than 40 days away from Shockfest. We're going to be doing a lot more. So for those of you who are watching out there, if you just want to keep track of what we're going to be doing on the Shockfest team, just quickly go to shockfest.tv and you will find all the LMTV episodes as well as that we have done. And also, this is a place where we're going to start to do some pre-show interviews. We're hoping to get Gerald on again once a year. We're hoping to get some of the sponsors. I just noticed that this year the sponsors don't have an opportunity to present at Shockfest. Is that right, Tim?
That's kind of what I heard. They've changed it up immensely. They're going to have a thing
which is fine. I think that's fine. Actually, it's kind of awkward as a vendor, as a previous vendor myself. It's kind of awkward to present at Shockfest anyway, because the bar is set so high, right? Yeah. That it's very, very difficult. And
there's been troubles in the past, where people have come in and just made a sales call.
Right, and we don't want that. And we don't want that. We have a very simple slogan. If it ain't good enough for be good enough for Shockfest, it ain't going to be good enough for Shockfest.tv, right? So don't expect to come and just do a sales presentation and be on Shockfest.tv.
Yeah, they have a new thing this year they call the Reef also. This is where vendors can actually put up their table and meet people. So people that want
and that's fine.
That's a much better solution.
That's fine. Drive. It's not the content that people object to. It's sometimes just the context. People expect when you're on the stadium, on the podium, that they expect to be vendor neutral, even though they understand the commercial side of it, right?
Hey, Tony.
Yep.
Some of the things I tell people to watch for is when they're doing testing, be careful what you're testing with. I mean, I've seen people do ping of deaths. I've seen people run traceroute constantly to be looking at, have it running all the time. That's traffic that's loading down your stack in your router. Passwords, I love it when I go in and someone says, well, I'm having troubles with someone's changed my parameters, my router. And I say, well, who has authority? No one does. Well, what's the password? Oh, it's admin. So if you don't want your router parameters or switch parameters changed, don't give out the password. One of the things I've seen a lot lately is auto-negotiation problems where you get auto-negotiation storms going, and that's something you got to watch out for, especially if you're using tools that are not under the IEEE standard, like we see taps that have batteries in them that auto-negotiate. You don't want that. And traceroute for IPv6 and IPv4 are totally different.
Yep.
So don't try to do both at the same time because it'll cause a serious problem out there. So, and do you recommend a tool other than just the traceroute function? Do you have one that you like MDS or?
Yeah, I've got two tools that I don't use often enough. So honestly, it escapes my mind, and I couldn't dig it up in time for this. But if I get it, I'll add it to the article. But yeah, there are two tools. But I always say I'm a nerd, so I end up writing my own Perl scripts or batch files. But at the end of the day, there are some products. That's a good point.
Yeah, some open source tools.
Actually, one more thing. Tim and I had talked about what we want to do this year. In the past, we give away luggage tech, and we've done it for a few years now. And I've seen them all over the airport, so probably we saturate the market. So we thought, well, why don't we kind of take a break this year and then give us a whole year to prepare for something different. And what we plan to do not this year, but in 2016, is to give away USB thumb drives.
Oh, cool.
And you might say, well, what's so new about that? Well, except that what we're going to do is that this would be tools, some of which could be free and some of which could be commercial, but these would be tools that are tested and recommended by Tim and our other writers. And Tony, you're welcome to participate. And so this would be something that we can do to help our friends who are startups, as well as established company who might be our sponsors. Right, Tim?
Yeah, I think it'd be great to do, and I think that we include Tony, we include Laura Chappell, and maybe what we do is we get someone from our team to go out and actually do a presentation on the best tools to use for
Yeah, and
common
because
practices.
we kind of co-sponsors of each other. We sponsor Shockfest, and they sponsor us. And actually, every year they ask if we want to give a presentation. And
Well,
so
after last year I gave that one, they're through with us after that.
they're still talking about it, Tim.
I know, and not in a good way, but okay.
But that USB idea you have is great, Denny. I do that today. I give all my students USBs with some open source software and course material. So I've already written some of those articles already that we can start putting on.
Well, why don't we piggyback that, and so you could participate both.
Yeah, sure.
You know, we can give it out. You know, two first, right? So we can give one out. These would be free or premium, you know, whatever tools that we thought it would be interesting that as a recommendation. And then we can piggyback that and says these would be Tony's two-step.
Sure.
And you're also going to see from me this year, I'm going to do a lot more computer forensics tools with helping Casey, because that's becoming an everyday issue for network managers, just providing proof that they're not involved in something or something didn't evolve from them, and we're going to try to build up that open source market too.
Well, I think that whole idea, I mean, we might even brand it that way. You know, the whole idea of a bug out tool, you know, bug out bag, you know, like, you know, how you have everyday carry bags that we do now with, you know, all the survival tools. Just imagine that this would be the US drive that, you know, if you're going to take anything with you, this would be the one.
Right.
Maybe I can put it in my leg. My leg's got memory in it. Maybe I can just, you know, come up with one that fits.
Hey, guess what? We ran out of time, Tim. Okay. Well, thanks, Tony.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Great, Tony.
Running up to Shockfest, we're not going to be limiting ourselves to one show a week. We're going to be doing on demand. So that would be a way that you could participate in Shockfest without being there, and just you know, resurrect some of your presentations that are Shockfest related. It's not like they're gonna like you any less.
I got nothing to lose.
I'm sorry, that was an inside joke.
That was mean.
Okay.
That was mean. That was mean.
All right. Okay, guys. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tony. Bye bye.
Be blessed.
Next week, if not this week. Bye bye.